Hey everybody, Donnie Turner here with the Buying Tampa Bay podcast, and I'm joined with my two lovely co-hosts, Chase Clark and Peter Murphy. And today we have decided to tackle the topic of property taxes. Taxes, what a subject. And this one looks like it's going to be a pretty comprehensive episode. I'm probably going to have to be asking a lot of obvious questions for myself and the listeners. So let's get going right away. So how did property taxes become a thing? When did they begin, and why are they even there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's on all of our minds right now because if you're in the state of Florida, you just received what's called a trim notice, which is a truth in millage notice disclosing to you what your taxes are going to be for this coming year. And so a lot of us, especially investors, are a little apprehensive about how much money the government wants to take out of our pockets this year. But this goes all the way back to the early 1800s. Since then, governments have always sought a way to fund their activities through property tax. And there's been several different ideas revolving around that and several different iterations of taxes since that time. Some states going all the way back to 1834 in Tennessee imposed a tax on everything you own, not just your property, all your assets, all your furniture, all your, wagons, your buggies, your horses, everything. It was called a universal tax. And as you can imagine, nobody really liked that very much. And so over the years, that's been culled back a little bit just to tax you on physical property that you own in terms of land with buildings on it, and things like that. But over the years, there's been many reforms, and in many ways, citizens have fought against these taxes and attempts to increase these taxes, and have been successful in that in some ways, especially throughout the 20th century. But today, it's one of the big ways in which our local governments are funded. And it's based on the value of your property as determined by your local property appraiser. And there's many ways that they go about trying to determine the value of your property, which we'll talk about, here in a minute. But property taxes have been around for a long time. 200 years now we've been dealing with property taxes, and I don't think they're going away. And in fact, in the Tampa Bay area here, we just had several different counties have referendums during this primary season about increasing millage rates for schools. And so schools are saying we need more property taxes to pay for ourselves. And so if you're in Hillsborough, that got a big no. If you're in Pasco, it got a big yes. So people are divided on this topic, and property taxes are something that hits you hard in your wallet every year. It's a very sensitive subject to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, taxes are never fun or favorable, right? I don't think anybody likes paying taxes, even the ones that are rooting for more taxes. But I mean, at the end of the day, especially in a state like Florida, you guys could correct me in the future if I'm wrong, but property taxes are a bit more important than other states. So yeah, why exactly property taxes specifically? You mentioned that they fund the schools and everything else, but what else are they there for?
Well, in Florida, part of the reason why they're so critical is because we don't have a state income tax, right? And so many other states do, right? And so they're getting a big chunk of their revenue from income taxes, and we're not. And so as a result, governments and municipalities have got to pay for their services somehow. And so what they've chosen to tax instead of your income are your properties, right? And so much of what Chase was talking about earlier, schools, right? I mean, taxes are for the children, right? And you make the appeal that this tax revenue is going to be for the children, and people are willing to stroke a check, right? And we're going to dig in there and see how much the children are really getting, and they're getting, and they are getting a lot, right? So from our property taxes. But we have states which derive about 2% of their total funding from property taxes. It's not a huge amount of revenue generator for the state, but for the locals, it's gigantic. It's almost 50% of their operating budgets come from property taxes for local municipalities. And it's everything you can imagine, right? It's, of course, how we fund our schools. It's how we fund our fire departments, our police departments, our roads, our environmental initiatives that we have all throughout our governments. Our stormwater runoff, that's a big deal in Florida, where you've got a whole lot of stormwater that you've got to contend with. That's funded by property taxes. Who wants their trash mounting up, right? I hear that in Sweden right now, where they're having a strike, a big strike. It's London, excuse me. No, Scotland. That's where I heard it. Big strike in Scotland right now in the middle of a festival on, by the trash haulers over there. And so trash is just mounting up in the streets because they can't get right their compensation. Your trash is paid for by your property taxes. And, so are your ports, right? There's a whole lot that has to happen on your ports. Your libraries have to get funded. All of these things and others are covered in your property taxes. And when you get your trim notice in the mail, you can attempt to find all of those things in the line items. And they're not all crystal clear. So, for example, you'll see Children's Board is a special taxing district, and that covers a whole lot of things that affect children, right? And so you got to dig deep to find out what some of those things are.
Yeah, lots of fun stuff going on there on those trim notices. It's like you need an interpreter sometimes to tell you what they mean and who's getting your money.
You do. And I should say, some of you probably got trim notices that included ad valorem taxes, which are taxes based upon value, and non-ad valorem taxes, which are special taxing districts that you might have that affect your property. We'll dig into that in a little bit more detail later in the episode, but it's not just about what your home is worth. It's about where your home's located and what special amenities you have access to, and you might see a whole lot more taxes than what I just discussed right here.
No, yeah, makes sense. I mean, you mentioned the lack of income taxes. I mean, that's probably one of the big reasons that a lot of people find Florida favorable. But honestly, as well, I mean, it sounds like property taxes fuel a lot of the infrastructure here. And I mean, I could speak specifically for Tampa, Florida. That's where I've spent most of my time in this state. And I've been impressed with the state of the infrastructure. I mean, most of it seems new, well-functioning, well-run. You guys might have a different opinion on that, but coming from where I'm coming from, I mean, I remember in California, we probably have a trash strike, like it seemed like a weekly event. So I don't know if that happens a lot here, but who knows?
But it's a stable form of taxation. And I think that's what the state of Florida has recognized. You tax people's income. Incomes are wild, especially for the wealthy, right? There's all kinds of loopholes and ways that you can avoid recognizing your gigantic wealth. And property taxes is that thing that's a little bit more easy to substantiate, to quantify, right? And whereas it's a highly progressive tax, and by progressive, I mean this is a tax that increases as you become more wealthy, right? And not everyone in Florida owns properties. So people who don't own properties don't pay property taxes. And as we've already mentioned, this is a huge source of income for states and for local governments. And lower income people are paying almost nothing of their wages in taxes or tax bill toward that item. The wealthier are. And so, again, very easy to see and measure and quantify and trend over time. And I think a little bit more stable for governments to budget on.
Yeah, one thing probably worthy of pointing out here at this point in the podcast too is about other ways that the state is funded in terms of sales tax. And here in the state of Florida, everyone pays sales tax, right? Even the visitors coming in, the several million people that come to Florida every year, every dollar they spend is taxed 6% to the state. Here in Hillsborough County, there's another 1.5% that goes to the county. And 1% of that goes to roads, transportation, infrastructure, and the other 0.5% goes to schools. And so some may argue that a sales tax is actually the most fair and most advantageous form of tax to a state like Florida because of our high level of tourism. We're not only getting money from our own citizens here in Florida through sales tax, we're getting money from every single person that spends $1 inside of the borders of this state. And sales taxes have actually proven themselves to be a much greater generator of revenue on a consistent basis for a government than property tax. And so some advocates may say, well, hey, do away with property tax. We don't have income tax here. Do away with property tax too, and just make the sales tax 9 or 10%. And now you'll have a lot more people paying it. Everyone pays it, and you're not just targeting people that own property. So, interesting argument on that side of the equation there.
No, yeah, that's interesting. I'm glad you guys both mentioned that. I mean, my initial takes on both of those, if I care to share, is thinking that I think I do agree that property taxes to a degree are maybe a little more recession proof, maybe a little slower to increase and decrease. At least that's the idea behind it, right? I'm thinking of income tax. I mean, there's only going to be so many tech booms in Silicon Valley. And if we're in an environment that we are right now, where the NASDAQ is down like X percent, maybe like 30% year over year or something like that, so, and that's probably the bulk of the income tax that California is getting. They're probably hurting right now. And, I'm thinking about sales tax. I mean, sure. Yeah, I bet Orlando is swimming in it, right? With all the tourism dollars and all the merchandise sales. Everybody wants to get their Mickey Mouse hats. And yeah, raising it up a few percentage points, I don't think that would dissuade anybody from coming here. But at the same time, I mean, we just got out of a pandemic 2 years ago. I mean, where Disney was essentially shut down, right? That could be, I'm sure the loss of tax revenue was probably hurtful for the state. I mean, that was a black swan event. Lord willing, it'll never happen ever again. I mean, at least in our lifetimes. So I don't know. That's just my musings on it.
No, it's valid. And, of course, there's plenty of cases, especially when we look overseas, where sales taxes are astronomically high. You've got your value-added taxes of 20s and in the 20s and 25% in much of Western Europe. And, of course, they've got property taxes and they've also got income taxes, right? So you're paying like well into the 70% of your income on taxes. And that's because when we look at older states and older infrastructures, your state becomes more expensive to sustain over time, not generally less, right? You've built your roads. Now you've got to actually maintain your road, because guess what? Your road has a lifetime of about 30 years. Then it's got to be redone, right? So lots of expense and lots of very challenging questions to deal with. But nonetheless, property taxes are a big thing here, and they're probably not going away for a long time.
And thank goodness we don't have a monarchy to support with our property taxes. That'd be a whole other line item on the Trump statement.
Yeah. Yes, it would, wouldn't it?
But, given that property taxes are tied to the value of what your property is, you might ask the question here, well, how is property value determined, right? And so we've got here in Florida an office of the property appraiser, and each county has its own property appraiser who on January 1st of every year determines the value of everyone's property. And there's a lot that goes into this. At least you'd like to think maybe there's a lot that goes into this. But for traditional residential properties, the value is supposed to be determined based on comparable sales. And so with the advent of all kinds of technologies to help determine house values these days, most property appraisers take advantage of software that gives them what we might just call in lay terms a desktop appraisal of your property. It goes out and gathers all the transactional data from comparable sales, aggregates that in some algorithm, and comes up with a value for your property, which is called the just or the market value. And so, if there's any question, the property appraiser will sometimes send out their army of inspectors, in their little logo vehicles all over the county to, just do a drive-by and say, oh, is that house really is it worth that much? If there's a red flag or an outlier in that situation. But where property taxes start is determining this market value, or what they call just value of your property. And then from there, there's two other numbers that really are going to make a big difference in how much tax you pay. The second one is the tax assessed value. Okay, so you have market value and then you have tax assessed value. So the tax assessed value is just the taxable portion of that market value of your property. And you say, well, how could that be different? Well, in Florida, we've got several different exemptions that you might qualify for that will reduce your market value of your property down to a lower number, which would then be considered your tax assessed value, right? So it's the taxable portion of your market value. And so usually this number is capped in how much it can increase every year. So if you're in your homestead, your primary residence, this number can only go up 3% a year here in Florida under the Save Our Homes cap. And what that's tied to is CPI. So 3% is the max, but it's going to be the CPI every year, the Consumer Price Index number. So this may be lower, and historically it has been lower in most years. It's been under 2%. But lately, with inflation the way it is, we've hit this 3% cap now for the last couple of years on that number. For non-homestead properties, which is like for us investors, rental properties you've got, vacant land that you have, there's a 10% cap then on that. And historically, this tax assessed value here around Tampa Bay has been somewhere between 70 and 80% of the true market value of your property. And when I say true market value, that's typically what you could sell it for on the open market, not necessarily the number that the property appraiser is going to find using their desktop appraisal software, but probably pretty close, somewhere in that ballpark. And so that tax assessed value is going to be about 70 to 80% of what that market value normally would be. And that's what you're going to be assessed your taxes on. You've got your market, your just value, you've got your tax assessed value, and then you've got the actual taxable value, which is what they'll calculate the millage rate against, which we'll talk about in a minute, to determine how much money you actually owe each year on your taxes. So market value, tax assessed value, and then actual taxable value are the three numbers that are going to appear differently on your statement when you look at that trim notice.
Okay, great. And yeah, for the audience, so a homestead, that is a property that you yourself are residing in. That's your personal residence?
That's right. Yes, your primary residence.
Yeah, and so it's capped at 3% or the CPI, whichever is lower, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, not a bad deal. And then if you're an investor, you get hit with that big bad 10%, right?
Yeah. Yeah, they like us to stick it to the greedy landlords, right?
Sure. Well, here's a scenario for you. So, what about new construction? How exactly does that work?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And I think, when you see some articles, we talked a few minutes before we started the pod about, the potential issues with foreclosure coming up over the next year or so. And this is a good example of something that can put a family in a really tight economic position, because when you buy a new home that's new construction, typically after you close the first year, you're only going to pay taxes on the assessed value of the dirt, of the actual lot that the home was built on. Because remember, these properties are assessed every January 1st. So depending on when you close on the home, you could have a gap there. And so in the first year, you may pay like $1,000 in property tax just on the dirt. But you built a $500,000 home. And so then the following year, you're going to be paying taxes on $500,000 if that's the tax assessed value. And your tax bill is probably going to be somewhere around $8,000 or $9,000. Well, if you've got a conventional or traditional mortgage and you've got an escrow account, all of a sudden your mortgage payment went up $700 or $800 a month. And if you hadn't prepared for that or planned for that, that's a major lifestyle change for you. That's like turning your BMW back into the dealership, because that's also $800 a month and you can't afford it anymore.
We'll be back after a quick break.
You hear a lot about supply chains these days, because if the past couple years have taught us anything, it's that an efficient, well-managed supply chain is absolutely critical to keeping businesses successful and consumers happy. I'm Will Haywood, and I host a podcast called All Business, No Boundaries, where we talk about supply chains, how they work, what happens when they don't, and the innovations that are redefining what's possible in the world of logistics. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Whole lot less Starbucks and Chipotle. Yeah,
a lot.
Oh man. Okay, so that's a really good tip. I never even really realized that. Just the delayed on the taxable value. So yeah, thank you for that. So Okay, I mean, so we've been in this inflationary environment. We've been in an environment where, real estate only goes up, right? That's what I've been told.
Right.
Real estate only goes up. So, Peter, let me ask you this. So, what would happen if my real estate actually went down? What would happen to my taxes then?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like, so let's go back to the whole real estate going up thing and reinforce what that means for you if you're paying property taxes, right? Let's say you're in a cycle of appreciating property value and your home price has increased 5, 6, 10% a year. Or wow, what if it's 20% a year like it has over the last couple of years? And now the market value of your home is very, very high. Well, tax ordinance taxes you not on the market value of your home, but on the taxable value, right? Which we've already talked about is impacted by both the cap in what that value of your home can increase every year, which is 3% if you're an owner occupant, and also by exceptions or exemptions that you might have. So that tax basis should only have increased the value for taxable purposes 3% per year over the course of the last 10 years, whereas your market value might have gone up 5, 10, 15, 20%, right, in any given year. So you could look at your property right now and look at your taxable value, and it's wildly different. It's well below the market value of your home for taxable purposes. And when that's the case, homeowners are happy, right? They're being taxed on a value far less than market value. So if you're in a scenario where your market value begins to fall, it might take a whole long time before the market value of your property comes back down to earth and comes somewhere close to what the taxable value of your property is currently. Maybe those bear no visible correlation to each other right now. Well, over the course of time, you could see market value coming down because home values are decreasing, but your assessed value is still well below what market value is. So that means your taxes aren't necessarily going to fall, right? Your property taxes might stay exactly where they've been for a long time while that market value drops down to catch up to them. So it's a really important realization that you've got to make. Now, you might be in a market, on the other hand, where home values come down rapidly, right? And let's say you bought this year, and so you're paying a market value, or last year, I should say, and so you're paying a taxable value that's very close to your market value. And let's say we face a 20% decrease in home values this year. Well, then you might find that your assessed value, your taxable value, is higher than your market value. And so what you'll find is that army of evaluators that are employed by the county might reflect that decrease in taxable value on your trim notice. And you might discover that the taxable value of your home is right in line with the falling market value of your home. If you don't discover that, and you can prove based upon market data that the taxable value of your home is above market value, well, you can go in front of the Value Adjustment Board and you can make an appeal. And every county has a VAB, or a Value Adjustment Board, where you can present comps and show that your home is worth less than what the market value that the county is reporting that your home is worth. And they'll bring their comps to the table. And whoever's got the best comps wins, right? That's kind of how that works. And if your comps show that your market value is below what the county has assessed your home, well, they'll reassess the tax basis of your home to match market value. And in a rapidly declining market or a sustained declining market, that is a very viable option, a very important option for you to take. And so look very closely at your trim notice to make sure that your market value of your home is not higher than what the actual market value of your home is. Because if it is, you have the opportunity to go in front of the Value Adjustment Board. So do keep that in mind. This is a thing that, maybe you can throw up at some point, a graph that will be helpful for viewers and for listeners to understand. But home values go up and down, and there is a smoothing effect that our taxing authorities have attempted to put in place with the Save Our Homes caps and this thing called portability that helps try to cap and smooth out the rates of increase and decreases of your real estate tax. And so generally speaking, that smoothing effect, it allows us to be able to escape these drastic increases or decreases in tax value that we might face.
Yeah, good stuff. So, Okay, so yeah, we talked about how the property gets assessed. What happens if my property goes down in value, goes up in value, but let's talk a little bit about exemptions. So how does all that work when it comes to taxable value?
Yeah, so we talked about these three value numbers that you'll find on your trim notice: the market value, the tax assessed value, and then the taxable value. And so from market value, you take out caps and you get to tax assessed value. Then from tax assessed value, you take out exemptions and you get down to the taxable value. And so exemptions play a pretty important role in that process. And, the one exemption I think a lot of people are aware of on your primary residence is your homestead exemption. And in Florida, that's $50,000. But on the school portion of your taxes, it's only $25,000. And so you'll notice that you pay a different rate on school taxes than you do on everything else because of this difference in the homestead exemption. So that's a big one. And that's been around since 1995 here in Florida. The other one that we have that's become very big, and it was just implemented a couple of years ago, is portability. And what portability does, it allows you to transfer the accumulated difference between your market and your assessed value up to $500,000 to another home. And so back in the day, before portability, people were getting penalized by selling their home and moving. If they had lived in their home for a long time and had a relatively low tax assessed value that had only risen by the 3% cap every year or less, they may have been living in $1 million house, but only had a tax assessed value of $150,000 because over 20 or 30 years, that's where the market went. But with only a 3% increase per year, they were still only paying taxes on $150,000. Then they'd go and buy a new house. They'd sell this house for $1 million, go and buy a new $500,000 house. And all of a sudden they were paying $8,000 or $9,000 in property tax every year. Well, now portability would have allowed them, and now does allow them, to transfer up to $500,000 of cap reduction between your tax assessed value and your taxable value to your new home. And you can carry this with you from home to home to home now. And so it's kind of removed that roadblock of people who have been in a home for a long time, selling that home and moving into a new one and not having to pay really high levels of property tax, since they're kind of grandfathering in, all of their cap space, if you will, to reduce their taxable value. So those are the two big ones: homestead exemption, portability. And then there's a whole list of other things that, here locally, at least, and some of these are county by county, but, widows, blind, disabled veterans, elderly people, there's all kinds of exemptions for that range from $500 to $5,000 a year in reduction off your tax assessed value. And then, a big one for especially people involved in the agriculture industry is what we call a green belt in Florida. And it's an agricultural exemption for property tax on land that is used for profitable agricultural purposes. So it's not necessarily people that have a hobby farm or have, a couple extra pets in the backyard. This is for people that are growing crops, that are growing corn and blueberries and strawberries and peppers and watermelons and things like that. People that have orchards or groves, people that raise cattle, goats and cows and horses and things like that. And what the county here allows you to do is basically exempt the value of the land devoted 100% to agricultural purposes from paying tax, from paying property tax. And so it's a huge deal. And, a lot of people say, well, that's a subsidy to farmers. Well, you're exactly right. It's a subsidy to farmers. The governments, both federal, state, and local, have done things over the years to incentivize agricultural activities. And this is just one of them that really helps farmers make ends meet when it comes to producing crops or producing livestock that are used for agricultural purposes. And it's a huge thing, especially here in Eastern Hillsborough County. and the southeastern quadrant of the county here, where there's a lot of ag activity on large tracts of land, and helps the farmers. It's a great incentivizer for farming and agriculture.
So, quick question. So, let's say, I live out in rural, Central Florida. I got a couple acres of land, and I want to start farming, whatever I decide to farm. So, how do I go about earning that greenbelt exemption? Like, is there a line? Is there an inspection that needs to be had? Can I just get a couple goats and call it a day? How does that work?
Yeah, you do have to have a going concern on your property. So, and it has to be generally a for-profit enterprise. So your property must be utilized that. It can't be just a pie in the sky plan. You must actually make the investments to upgrade your property for use for your agricultural purpose, and do that according to best practices. So if you're growing groves, then you plant your trees according to best practices. You irrigate them correctly. You have a fertilizer regimen. You have equipment to support and sustain that operation. And you've got to have that going at the time where you make application to the taxing authority for a greenbelt exemption. And you also have to have a business plan, right? They're going to want to see an actual business plan that projects that you will make some money on that operation once it's up and running at some reasonable amount of time. And so together with a going concern that looks like it's been done correctly and a business plan that supports that model, you can make application to the municipality for a greenbelt exemption. And at that point, they'll review the feasibility of what you're doing, and they'll look at your operation. They'll actually come by and physically inspect it, and they'll look at the amount of land you have devoted to it. And if they think there's consistency and truthfulness in your application, that you legitimately have an agricultural enterprise, they'll grant you that exemption. There used to be limits on the size of the property. That does not exist anymore because there are people that do micro farms, and farming can be done at a far smaller level than it once was done and be productive and profitable. So get your act together, spend the money on the operation, do it right, then make application for your greenbelt. And if you have a reasonable local property tax assessor, they will grant that in all likelihood. Then you have to keep it going, right? Because they're going to inspect it once a year. So you've got to sustain that operation over time. And if that land use ever changes, they're going to want you to notify. So if you switch from strawberries to citrus, they're going to want you to tell them that you're doing that. Don't shut down your operation, or they'll inspect it and you'll lose your exemption.
So one other note on that for all the investors out there, because buying raw land is an interesting investment, and it can be a costly one because quite often it doesn't produce income. So one way to invest in land and avoid paying property taxes is to lease your land to a farmer. And so let's say you want to speculate on a piece of dirt that you think is in the path of development and is going to be worth a lot more than you can pay for it today. Find a local cattle rancher and lease your land to them. They'll be glad to take it off your hands. They'll file the greenbelt application for you. And that's a perfectly legitimate and legal way to greenbelt your property, is through a lease to a farmer. So if you don't want to get your hands dirty, if you don't want to own cattle or plant groves or maintain a garden or row crops, then lease it to somebody else who knows what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I always wanted to be a cowboy, but maybe I'll just lease it. Maybe. Yeah. All right. Okay. So, no, that's great stuff, guys. Thank you so much. I mean, that's pretty incredible. That greenbelt exemption. So, definitely worth considering for people that own good tracts of land. Earlier in the episode, we were using a term pretty often, and I'm sure it got the audience scratching their heads a little bit, using the word millage, or the millage rate. So, yeah, what exactly is that?
Okay, good question. We should define our terms, right? So millage the millage tax is kind of what a property tax is often called, right? So they're almost synonymous, but there is a technical definition for what a mill is. A mill is 1/1000th of a dollar, right? So in property tax terms, that's $1 of tax for every $1,000 of tax assessment. So cities, municipalities apply a millage rate to your properties to help them calculate taxes. And the millage rate, so the dollar of tax for every $1,000 in tax assessed value for Hillsborough County, where we're located, is roughly 17.9, right? So if you have, let's say if you have $100,000 in taxable value on your property, you're going to pay about $1,790 in taxes on that property that year. So that's kind of the rough math that helps you get to what your tax bill is. That's the millage rate. In the city of Tampa, the millage rate is higher. It's like 19.7 or so. In the city of Temple Terrace, it's even higher, right? And the idea here is that each local government, the city of Temple Terrace, Hillsborough County, city of Tampa, sets a budget for what it's going to cost for them to operate their municipal business. And based upon that budget, they're going to generate a millage rate that they need to assess to all of their residents in order to make their budget, right? And that's why you see a variation in millage rates, whether you're in in unincorporated area or you're in Hillsborough County or whether you're in Tampa or somewhere else, because different cities have different cost structures that will affect their homeowners differently, different costs for running their fire departments, for example, or different road maintenance standards. And all of those things might change the tax bill you get every month or every year from that municipality. So do keep that in mind. The millage rates are voted on for approval, and so if you've got a trim notice, you're going to see a bunch of different columns in that trim notice, and the yellow column will say, if we make a proposed budget, and if all those budget changes are approved, this is what your tax value is going to be. If we don't make any changes to last year's budget, then this is what the green column is going to be. And so you'll see that there will be a vote at some point in time where that millage rate will be voted on by the taxing authority in your county. And that will be the basis for which your actual tax expense is assessed. Super technical, I know, but important to understand.
No, I think you set that up very well. Okay.
Yeah, one thing also to remember about millage rates is that they don't usually wildly change. They stay within a pretty narrow bandwidth. I mean, to get a one full mill increase from someone is a big deal, right? So, like this year, looking at our portfolio, I think we're seeing 0.03% increase in overall effective millage on our portfolio. So, very small number of the increase in millage overall, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that we don't get that cap for school taxes, and so assessed values have gone up dramatically this year because we're catching up to that pandemic run up in the housing market, and so now we're paying a lot more in school taxes than we are in some of our other taxes that take advantage of that cap. So while we've only had a 0.03% increase in our effective millage, our overall property taxes have gone up almost 25% this year. So, about 11 or 12% on historical properties we've owned, but some of the new properties that we just bought since the pandemic have seen exorbitant increases because of those. When a transfer happens, you lose the cap and it resets. And so, millage has become really important, in that regard, keeping that millage rate as low as possible, because the assessed values here in Florida obviously keep rising and rising and rising.
In case it's not obvious, when you look at your trim notice, millage rates are cumulative. So you're going to see a millage rate assessed for schools, and one at the state level and one at the local level. You'll see a municipal millage rate. You'll see one for swift mud or water management in our district. You add all those together, and that gets you to your total millage rate that your property is taxed on, right? So you can drill down and see how much you're actually paying to support your school every year, or your environmental initiatives every year. And that gives you an idea. You as a homeowner are paying $600 for every $100,000 in value for school. Hey, is that worth it? Your kid getting $600 in value from education? So it helps you kind of put some of those things in perspective and vote accordingly. If you're like, wow, the value I'm getting for education for my child is well in excess of that amount, well, then maybe you should be voting in favor of an increase in millage for schools, right? You might be on the other side of that equation too, and like, no way, I'm paying too much, right? And people who have no children have an incentive to look at that and say, why would I vote for the increase in school taxes, right? I mean, so These are some of the moral dilemmas that happen on voting and millage rate discussions and everything else. Worth remembering.
No, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's based mostly on county, right? So
yes, there are county by county basis under which these discussions are made.
Yeah. So, for instance, maybe the villages, whatever county they're in, they're probably not putting a lot of mills towards education, I would assume, or whatever else. So
that's interesting. I don't know. I haven't looked. I wonder how they're voting for their education, because my guess is Sumter County is in deep need of strong educational resources, but I don't know how those constituents vote for that.
Sumter County has actually got some of the best schools in the state of Florida now, believe it or not, because it went from being a very rural area to a highly populated area over the last 15 years. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know what they're paying in taxes each one, but I do know Sumter County has a relatively low millage rate. And that may have a lot to do with the fact that inside the villages, they pay for and support their own schools through other means, possibly through CDDs or through, having land and buildings granted over to the school board as part of the development.
That's a good point. And of course, it begs the question of CDDs, and we really haven't talked about them much yet, but this is a whole different discussion, right?
Yeah, that's that nasty thing that comes after they assess you on the value of your property, the non-ad valorem taxes, right? And that can be pretty steep. You may think, you live in a CDD neighborhood, you probably have a pretty nice house. I mean, most of these are fairly, recent developments. I think the advent of the CDD was sometime in the mid 80s. And a lot of these are gated communities with lots of really nice amenities, and the values are very high. And so you live in one of these communities, you're probably paying a lot of ad valorem property tax. Ad valorem meaning, again, based on the value of your property. But you also have a CDD, which is a community development district. And it's a separate entity that the state of Florida allows to act as a taxing authority. And what those taxes are not based on the value of your property. They're a fixed amount that you're assessed every year based on what the developer set for your particular lot or house in that neighborhood. And these taxes go to pay for all kinds of amenities in your neighborhood, the fancy street signs, the fancy, lantern looking street lights, the brick paved, entrances, and the monuments, and the all that granite and, courts and everything else that you see all over these places. Sometimes it's a golf course clubhouse that's included in that. And so you've got that not only is part of your non-ad valorem, things like trash collection, things like storm water maintenance, things like street lights. There's all kinds of things like that can be what I call below the line. And so these don't always have anything to do with the value of your property. In fact, that's why they're called non-ad valorem. These are assessed as fixed fees by different entities for specific services that are being provided. And they're added on to your total property tax. So they've got to be paid in addition to what's being assessed by the tax assessor as an ad valorem tax on your property. And so every year when these trim notices get sent out, and the property appraiser has got to send these out by law by September 1st. And so that's why we're talking about this today, because tomorrow is September 1st, and most of us already have these notices in our hands, like Peter was showing you on the screen a few minutes ago. It has to disclose to you all of this information. And as Peter mentioned earlier, you've got 15 days. That's it. You've got 15 days to dispute the value that you see on your trim notice. Tax bills are going to be generated on November 1st, and the taxes are due no later than March 31st of next year. So you've got this 15-day period from September 1st to September 15th to contact your property appraiser's office and tell them you've got a problem with the value and request a review. So make sure you stay on top of that. Make sure you pay attention to your trim notice, because it's an important document. And once that deadline passes, there's really nothing you can do about it.
Hey, I wanted to bring up as far as some of these community development district improvements that was something we're seeing around Florida a lot these days are the developments of these lagoon communities. These are massive water parks, almost naturally filtered lagoons, sandy bottoms. I mean, we're talking about 30-acre swimming pools in some cases with sanded shores of banks all around them and water slides and just about everything you can imagine. And it's very innovative because the developers of these communities have put these in and, of course, funded them with community development district taxes on the residents. But they're also putting in play a profit model there where they're willing to charge non-residents a fee to come in and use them. So the amenities that your community has will certainly be a cost to you, but they will enhance your lifestyle, supposedly. And maybe there will be a profit option for the community to be able to actually sell admission to them. Last of all, in most cases, CDDs will go away after a period of time. So they may receive full funding over a course of 20 or so years, unless the board votes to keep them in play. They do sunset over time. So you buy into a community with a CDD and it's toward the end of that CDD's life, you might notice your taxes going down, which that's a wonderful gift. That's happened to some of our communities here locally in Tampa that were built on the shoulders of CDDs, and those are now gone. And folks who are living there a lot more affordably than they used to be.
That's pretty cool. Quick question about that. So CDD fees, I mean, so yeah, if I understand what you're saying, they're on very specific improvements to the community. Are they perpetual or can they be paid off?
They definitely can be paid off. Yeah.
It's a bond that the developer issues to the community. When they come in and spend, $15-20 million to put, these massive improvements in, the state of Florida has allowed them to issue a bond, and each member of the community is responsible for paying their portion of that bond payment back over time. They're usually 20-year bonds.
Very cool. Very good stuff. All right. Well, let's switch it up with another question. So I know this is a pretty popular sentiment. I've heard it so many times, and people say, you don't really own your house until you've paid it off from the bank. And what I usually say to that is, yeah, try not paying your property taxes.
Right.
So let's go into that a little bit. So what would happen if I just decide, you know what, government, I don't know anybody, anything, I'm not going to pay my property taxes?
Well, I think the government realizes that property taxes are a big expense. And, a lot of people who don't escrow, and that means, most people, they have a mortgage on their property, and their lender, in order to keep their mortgage risk down, will actually collect a percentage in your mortgage payment that covers the cost of your insurance and the cost of your taxes. That's your escrow, right? So your escrow will pay your taxes for you because you're kind of prepaying that bill with your monthly mortgage payment. And your lender is required to hold your escrow, your tax prepayment in an escrow account. And at the time that your bill becomes due, which is by March 31st of every year, the lender will actually stroke a check to your municipality to pay the tax bill. That's how the lender makes sure that the tax bill gets paid and the government doesn't come and seize your house for non-payment of taxes. Because, of course, the government can do that, right? Their absolute first position, they have the ability to foreclose and sell your home over anyone else, maybe with the slight exception possibly of your homeowners association, right? The government can do that for the non-payment of your taxes, or the IRS, of course, quasi-government entities for sure with IRS, quasi with HOAs, right? But you got to pay your bills. And in most people's cases, if they have a mortgage, that tax bill is paid for them. But there's lots of people who don't have mortgages. And then those people are striking big checks once a year to cover their tax liability. So that's a huge check. A lot of people might not have that kind of cash sitting around, right? And so the government allows for you, your local municipality, it allows for you to really forestall the payment of your tax bill by the issuance of what is called a tax certificate. And so a tax certificate is like a bond that the municipal authority, the taxing authority, will sell on your tax bill to another investor. And that bond will have an interest rate that the other investor will earn as they essentially pay your taxes for you for a period of time. That can be done for up to 2 years. After 2 years, that investor has the right to file for a tax certificate on your property, which means if you haven't paid your property taxes for a couple of years. They've been paying the cost of your property taxes through this bond, and they can actually apply for a tax deed on your property, and they can take it over from you through that foreclosure process. They'll have to sue for foreclosure. They'll have to win the foreclosure sale, but through that tax deed process, they can win ownership of your property if you have not paid your taxes. Now, it takes several years to get there, but they have the power to do that by being in the position of this taxable bond, which they've been paying for on your behalf all of these years. It's a tough place to be in, and you got to make sure you pay your taxes, or you're susceptible to this kind of adverse action.
Yeah, it's an interesting process, and for those investors out there, you may have participated in some of these online auctions that occur because of property taxes, and sometimes it's a really good place to pick up a property. One thing to consider too is I think some of us that are investors and have done this, you may be familiar with the redemption process in Florida, because even if you don't pay your property taxes and your property goes to sale, the state of Florida will allow you to come in and pay all of those back taxes and all of the fees and everything before the person that wins the auction actually funds that purchase. As long as you beat them to the clerk's office and pay all those fees, you can redeem the property. Very tough thing to do. I don't think it happens quite often. I at least haven't seen it happen very often. Usually people are long gone by the time the auction occurs. But that is an option that people do have available to them. And one other thing maybe to mention is that, the property appraiser, as Peter said before, does set this up so that you have plenty of time to pay your taxes. Whether you've got an escrow account or whether you're a cash payer on your own, from the time you get your trim notice till March 31st, you got 7 months to save up to pay this bill if you're going to pay it in full. If you can pay it earlier, they give you discounts for paying it starting in November. So when the bill comes out in November, if you pay it before November 30th, you get a 4% discount, then 3% for December, 2% in January, 1% in February, and 0% in March. And so they try to incentivize and help you in your process to pay those taxes.
Right. And so take advantage of that discount if you can. It's a 4%, a 3% discount is substantial. And that's available to you as an investor if you can prepay that tax, liability. But, there's plenty of people who believe that these kind of that the government has no authority to assess these kinds of taxes. These people do not win in court. They do not win at the end of the day. The government has unlimited resources to fight against these kinds of stances, and you are going to have a really hard time redeeming your property once it's been bought and clear title is issued to another investor. So my recommendation is don't try this. This will not end in a good situation for you and your family to not pay your taxes.
One fun thing that we've got to experience over the years is buying properties at a tax auction when the homeowner is still living in the house and has no plans to move. Yeah. It's a sad thing, but there's a legal process for it. And, quite often people think, well, it's my house, I can just stay here. And there is a remedy for that and a way to get them out of the house. Takes a little time sometimes, but don't think that you can stay in the house if you haven't paid your taxes.
Definitely I appreciate it. I think this was a pretty important episode because these types of taxes, maybe most people, especially people that have had mortgages on their houses or have rented their entire lives, either way, your property taxes are sort of baked in to your payment, right? So you don't really worry about it. But events like paying off your house or, selling your house, etc., could create this, event where it just kind of sneaks up on you. So yeah, good stuff, guys.
Right. Yeah. I think that's the important thing to remember. Just because you're not affected every year by this increase, or you don't like feel the full brunt of it because your lender maybe has been escrowing for you. And, maybe you're in a situation where you have a new home and your lender has escrowed a certain amount of money for you, but now your trim notice comes out and your taxable value on your home is way up. And now the lender's got to issue you a special assessment, essentially, for you to fund the escrow shortfall in your escrow account to pay for your taxes. You'll notice it for sure then, right? But out of sight, out of mind is something that really can surprise a lot of homeowners. And you definitely don't want to find yourself in that position if you've just bought a home. Be prepared. Make sure you've budgeted for that increase in taxes that will come about a year from the time you've purchased your home. I think of all the things that we've said in this episode, that's probably the most important because it has the ability to be hugely disruptive to the life of a new homeowner. Don't be a victim of that circumstance.
And for all you landlords out there, remember this, rent is a hot topic these days. Rents are high. Rents have been increasing, but costs are also increasing. And so when you go out to renew your leases with your tenants, show them your trim notice. That may be plenty of justification for them to understand why the rent has to increase 6, 7, 8%. It's not just because you're going to pocket that money. It's because your insurance went up 30% and your taxes went up 12%. And you add those numbers together, and that can easily become a 6, 7, 8, even 10% rent increase for your tenant. So I'm sure you guys are paying attention to that. You know how that affects your bottom line. But use these tools, turn this onto the government, turn this onto the insurance company. Don't have an adversarial relationship with your tenant because they think you're pocketing this money. Be transparent with them. Show them what you're paying in taxes every year. It's benefiting them tremendously because guess what? They're not paying taxes.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's good stuff, guys. This was a very important episode. Maybe not an exciting one for most people, but incredibly important, right? To be able to get ahead of this, to be able to make sure that you're, paying the right amount of taxes, where these taxes even go. I found it incredibly informative. I'm sure the audience will too. So thank you guys.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Donnie.
Yeah.
Hey there, it's Peter Murphy with Buying Tampa Bay. Are you an investor who has ever wanted to own real estate in Tampa Bay? Or do you currently have real estate and want to grow your portfolio, add a few new investment properties? Or maybe you just need some awesome property management to de-stress your life. Well, here's what I found. HomeProp is hands down the best real estate investment brokerage in Tampa Bay. And they can help you build wealth in real estate, which is right in line with our podcast's mission to build wealth in real estate. And not just wealth as in dollars and cents, but in the quality of your life, the quality of your community, and just enriching what exists around you. So you want to learn more? Click on the link to HomeProp in the podcast description and give them a shot.